This had pushed entire generations of poor farmers into the cities. These urban poor were now eligible for heavily subsidized bread, so this was a huge drain on the public coffers. Over the decades, these mega plantations neglected their land, and much of it was just sitting there uncultivated. Domestic grain production dropped, while its demand continued to rise. This was a recipe for economic disaster, and the reformers had taken up the cause for generations, with some limited success. Caesar's first bill, on his first day, was meant to address this. He proposed that they set up a land commission, responsible for buying up land from willing mega plantations and redistributing it to the urban poor through a lottery. The expectation was that this would allow for thousands of urban poor to leave the city and set up small, profitable farms on previously unproductive land. In order to maximize the number of people affected, applicants were required to be married men with 3 or more kids. And as a friendly gesture to Pompey, veterans were also allowed to farm. These new farmers were forbidden from selling their land for 20 years in order to prevent the mega plantations from just going around and buying it all up again. Many senators were concerned with the cost of this plan. As a concession to them, Caesar allowed for a region in central Italy called Campania to be exempted from the bill, since much of the land here was actually owned by the government and provided a steady source of income. The land commission was to be made up of 20 prominent Romans, appointed by the consul, who would then be responsible for the land purchases. After some senators raised objections, Caesar added a line to the bill that barred himself from serving as a commissioner. The thing is, before the public assembly could approve any bill, it had to be posted publicly for 24 days. Normally this wouldn't really matter, but Caesar had to hold fasces when the law went into effect. He needed the 20 men on the commission to be answerable to him. If the law went into effect when Bibulus held fasces, he could just stack the commission with a bunch of guys that would just reject every land sale. Caesar only had a few days to get this bill through the Senate if he wanted to get it passed by the public assembly before February. After the initial compromises were made, Caesar painstakingly went line by line and read the entire bill in front of the Senate, stopping after every sentence and asking if there were objections. There were none. After he was done, debate opened up, and Cato rose to comment. He spoke about how it was a very fine bill, but this year was just a bad time to do any major land reform. And then he kept talking, and kept talking. The dude was filibustering the bill. Caesar was beside himself. He had held the Senate's hand through this entire process, made compromises left and right, and yet Cato was still trying to torpedo this bill for no specific reason. Caesar snapped. He ordered Cato arrested. He had the authority to do this as consul, but the Senate erupted into chaos. A bunch of senators stormed out, with one telling Caesar to his face that he'd rather be in prison with Cato than in the Senate with Caesar. The whole thing was a major misstep. Not only did Caesar alienate the entire Senate by trampling on its prerogatives, but he gave ammunition to his enemies. This is when they started to call him a tyrant. Caesar backed down. He released Cato and adjourned the Senate for the day. It was obvious that Cato and his conservatives weren't going to play nice, so Caesar had to think creatively. He took to the streets. He posted the full text of the land bill in the forum for anybody to read, and simply proclaimed that the public assembly would vote in 24 days. He then went around and started to make a series of speeches promoting the bill to the public. The Senate never passed the bill. Caesar just decided to skip a step. Due to a quirk in the Roman constitution, this wasn't technically against the law, but it just wasn't done. Pompey and Crassus surprised everybody by vocally supporting what Caesar was doing, which added some legitimacy to the whole thing. Caesar even invited Bibulus to come and debate the merits of the bill before the public. He came, but the crowd was so whipped up that he was booed off the stage before he even got a chance to speak. At the end of the 24-day grace period, it was time for the public assembly to vote on the bill. Before the vote, a large conservative delegation arrived, led by Bibulus and Cato, and followed by all of the conservative tribunes of the plebs and a bunch of lesser senators. The inclusion of the tribunes was significant because both they and the consuls had the power to veto the proceedings. They had come to do just that. Upon their arrival, the crowd flew into a frenzy. Bibulus was making his way towards the speaking platform when the crowd attacked him. His bodyguards were overpowered, and he was pulled into the crowd. Bibulus legitimately thought that he was about to be killed. Instead, the crowd dumped feces on his head. The conservatives were absolutely distraught over what they saw and fled for their own safety. Once they were gone, a vote was called and the land reform bill passed with a huge majority. Now, Bibulus would later claim that during this incident, he was exercising his veto the entire time, making the entire vote illegal. Caesar would claim that the roar of the crowd was so loud that nobody could hear what anybody was saying. You can decide for yourself who you believe. At last, Caesar finally got to appoint his commissioners, and oh, look at that, top of the list, Pompey and Crassus. On February 1st, Bibulus held Fasces. His first act was to call for a meeting of the Senate to officially condemn Caesar for his use of mob violence. At a minimum, he wanted the vote overturned, and there was even talk of stripping Caesar of his consulship. The speaking order in the Senate always went in order of prestige, and in this case the order turned out to be very significant. Bibulus held Fasces so he got to speak first. As the other sitting consul, Caesar spoke second, in his own defense. Then, consuls from the previous years got to speak, two of whom happened to be Pompey and Crassus. They both supported Caesar's actions and said that the vote was legal. This really got people's attention. Not only did Caesar have control over the mob, but he seemed to have the support of some of Rome's most powerful senators too. All of a sudden, no other senators felt comfortable criticizing Caesar. Bibulus's proposal died on the floor. After this incident, Bibulus retreated to his home and basically did not appear again publicly for the rest of his term. In the absence of his colleague, Caesar unexpectedly held Fasces again, and as a cherry on top, the Senate was now kind of terrified of him. He had his big signature piece of legislation in place, so he started paying back his allies. The first order of business was to ratify Pompey's conquests in the east. See, Pompey had conquered an incredible amount of territory in the east, adding 4 new provinces to Rome. He also set up new protectorates and negotiated new alliances. Upon his return, the Senate saw fit to award him with a triumph, but didn't bother ratifying his new conquests or treaties. Even when Pompey himself was consul, he couldn't get his own conquests recognized by the Senate, which only shows you how broken this system was during this period. Caesar was able to get this squared away with minimal opposition, much to Pompey's delight. Caesar also had to pay Crassus back for his support. Crassus had been supported by the tax collectors, who had gotten themselves into a bit of a bind. Rome didn't administer its own tax collection, but contracted it out to private companies who bid on how much tax they would be able to collect. Well, in the east, some of the tax collectors found themselves unable to meet their own bids, like by a lot. This was partially due to the fact that Pompey had spent years destroying commerce by conquering everything in sight, and partially due to the fact that the tax collectors just screwed up and overbid. Caesar lowered the amount of tax due by 1/3, and everybody walked away from the whole thing grumbling, but the problem was solved. Another weird piece of old business that Caesar wanted to clear up had to do with Egypt. The previous ruler, Ptolemy XI, having no legitimate heirs, left his kingdom to the Roman Republic in his will. After his death, Ptolemy XII, an illegitimate heir, assumed the throne, and Rome never bothered to press its claim. Finally, in Caesar's year, Ptolemy actually traveled to Rome to lobby for official recognition as the true ruler of Egypt. Apparently, Ptolemy paid Caesar and Pompey a king's ransom in bribes. Caesar asked that the Senate officially recognize Ptolemy's claim, and threw an alliance with Egypt in there for good measure. The Senate agreed, and the whole thing was taken care of. During this flurry of legislative activity, Bibulus, still housebound, would not stay quiet. Consuls had the power to decide when certain festivals and religious holidays were going to happen, and Bibulus was being a nuisance by putting them all on days when Caesar had votes scheduled. Technically, this should have made all of these votes illegal, but Caesar also happened to be Rome's head priest, and he seemed to think it was all okay. The people were quite content to just go along with this because they saw Bibulus as a laughingstock. Meanwhile, in the Senate, Caesar was able to get the money to resettle Pompey's veterans in the east, fulfilling his final legislative obligation to his fellow triumvirs. During the debate for this bill, one ex-consul named Lucullus spoke in opposition. When Caesar pushed back and lightly hinted that maybe it was time to start looking into old corruption charges, Lucullus threw himself on the ground and groveled at Caesar's feet like a slave, right there on the floor of the Senate in front of everybody. This was an ex-consul. It was shocking. You may, or may not, remember all the way back to before Caesar was consul, when the conservatives decided that he was needed to protect the woodland and country lanes of Italy after his term. Well, Caesar hadn't forgotten. Serving as governor after your term as consul was a huge perk, and Caesar wanted to make the most of it. One of Caesar's allies put forward a bill to give him the command of Illyricum, which was on the Adriatic Sea, and Cisalpine Gaul, which was in northern Italy, 2 provinces. This was for a 5-year command, which was longer than normal. He was also given the privilege of picking his own legates, which was usually something the Senate did. Just as this bill was going through, word came in that the governor of Transalpine Gaul had unexpectedly died. This province was just added to the mix, and by the end, the Senate had awarded Caesar 3 provinces and a total of 4 legions. By any conventional standard, this was overkill. Nobody got 3 provinces. sure the Senate's logic was that once Caesar left the capital, politics would slowly return to normal, and if they needed to give him 3 provinces to convince him to leave, that was fine. It was around this time that Caesar proposed his second land reform bill, only a few months after the first one had gone into effect. We simply do not have enough information on Caesar's motives for this. Either Caesar felt emboldened by his newfound monopoly on power, or he felt that his first land reform bill wasn't as effective as he had hoped. Honestly, I don't know. But with this second bill, he turned his sights towards Campania, the publicly owned land that was explicitly exempted from the first law.